Before we get started, there will be spoilers for the 1000-year Blood War arc of Bleach in the video to come. The Blade Is Me is one of the most impressive and memorable moments of the 1000-year Blood War arc. It's a cathartic point of resolution for our main character Ichigo, where he finally, after a long, over 500 chapter struggle, learns the truth about who he is and how his power came to be, and what makes him truly special. The end result of this enlightenment is the forging of Ichigo's true Zangetsu, and as he emerged from the smoke and flame, we were all shocked back in the day to see him now holding not one, but two blades. But Ichigo isn't the first character in Bleach to wield a dual Zanpakutō, though it is rare and places him among a very exclusive pantheon. Ancient captains like Kyoraku and Ukitake famously used two swords when in Shikai, while even a vice-captain Shuhei Hisagi was shown to have a dual Zanpakuto of his own. So, what's the deal with these weapons? At first, seemingly mythical Zanpakuto, of which there were supposedly only two, over time, their status has become less clear, their authority somewhat diminished. Instead of just being the weapons of two very old, very powerful Shinigami, it became obvious that there was more to these dual Zanpakuto than perhaps we first thought. So, what exactly are the so-called dual Zanpakuto? Is there really even such a thing? And what is the secret behind their existence? In today's video, I'm going to dive into the known examples of dual Zanpakuto, as well as reveal the truth behind what they are and how each of them seemingly came to be, and why Ichigo may be the only one to actually have a truly dual Zanpakuto in the end. So let's take a look. When Kyoraku and Ukitake activate their Shikai for the first time in Bleach, the two of them each produce a magnificent pair of Zanpakuto. At that point, the only dual Zanpakuto we had ever seen. Kyoraku's Katen Kyōkotsu takes the form of two completely separate black scimitars, complete with opulent crimson tassels dangling from the hilts. And if you've seen my recent short ranking my 10 favourite Zanpakuto, you'll know that this took the top spot. Meanwhile, Ukitake's Sōgyo no Kotowari is a little more restrained, though no less impressive, taking the shape of a pair of katana, each with a second angled blade protruding from the top. Unlike Kyoraku Shikai, however, here the two swords aren't totally independent of one another. They're connected by a rope from which dangle several talismans. Together, though, they're a wondrous sight to behold. Even Yamamoto, who himself had just unleashed his own incredible Ryujin Jaka, stared in quiet, contemplative awe for a moment when faced with both Katen Kyōkotsu and Sōgyo no Kotowari at the same time, musing that only two of their kind exist in all of the Soul Society. These two dual Zanpakuto would remain legendary and exclusive for some time within the series, apparently only reserved for two of Soul Society's most ancient and revered warriors. But then, in the early stages of the fake Karakura town battle, something most unexpected happened. Another dual Zanpakuto seemingly appeared. During his battle with Findor, Hisagi at long last released Kazeshini, his katana transforming into a pair of wicked, cruel-looking kusarigama connected by a black chain that could be wielded independently of each other at Hisagi's behest, creating an unpredictable whirlwind of razor-sharp blades. In theory, the physical design is very similar to that of Ukitake's Sōgyo no Kotowari, two weapons connected by a chain or a rope or something akin to that. So was this too one of these mythical Dual Zanpakutō, of which Yamamoto had previously said there were only supposed to be 2. Although a filler arc, I think it's worth taking note of, the Zanpakuto Rebellion arc would later reveal a large number of Zanpakuto spirits, some of which have even been repurposed into the canon story, including 2 Zanpakuto featured in this very video, Katen Kyōkotsu and Kazeshini to varying degrees, lending some credibility to the rest. Here we see that both Katen Kyōkotsu and Sōgyo no Kotowari are represented by 2 separate spirits. Katen Kyōkotsu takes the form of 2 women, one an adult and dressed in an ornate gown adorned with a skeletal headdress, while the other is much younger and hides her face beneath a black cloth. Meanwhile, Sōgyo no Kotowari appeared to be 2 identical twin children dressed in bright blue priestly garb. Considering, though, the 2 blades of both Katen Kyōkotsu and Sōgyo no Kotowari Shikai looking the same when released, what was the reason for the difference in appearance between Katen and Kyōkotsu when both spirits of Sōgyo no Kotowari were identical? At the time, it seemed likely due to the fact that Kyoraku himself actually wielded 2 sealed swords in base, with Katen Kyōkotsu being made up of a standard katana and a much smaller wakizashi. Meanwhile, Kazeshini was represented by just the one spirit, a shadowy, goblin-like demon with a penchant for killing. So what's going on there? Perhaps Kazeshini, despite its appearance, isn't a Dual Zanpakutō after all. Well, we'll get into that later. Again, I don't know how much stock you can really put into it, as the Zanpakuto Rebellion arc is filler, but then again, these designs were created by Kubo, and like I said, some of them, specifically Katen Kyōkotsu and even Kazeshini to a small degree, were repurposed into the source material. And then, much later in the story, after Ichigo learns the truth of his origin, that his strength and unique, perfect hybrid nature is a result of the coming together of his Shinigami father with his Quincy mother, the latter of who was later infected by viral hollow Reiatsu that forcibly hollowified its targets, Ichigo forges his true Zanpakuto, and it takes the shape of 2 distinctly different blades. As we see during The Blade Is Me, Ichigo has accepted all of his power as being a part of him. To him, it's all Zangetsu, no matter where it originates from. Therefore, the longer blade represents white, the combination of his Shinigami and hollow powers, while the shorter blade represents Old Man Zangetsu, his Quincy powers. Because Ichigo's powers are all inherently a part of him and have been since birth, they are all mixed into his Zanpakuto. There's no way around it. That means Ichigo technically does have 2 Zanpakuto spirits, White and Old Man Zangetsu, and as we see towards the very end of the series, he's already experimenting with being able to call on them both as he wishes. And so we have potentially 4 different Dual Zanpakuto on our hands. Katen Kyōkotsu, Sōgyo no Kotowari, Kazeshini, and Zangetsu. But with each of them comes a catch, to the point where the Dual Zanpakuto may not actually exist naturally at all. First up, we have Kyoraku's Katen Kyōkotsu, in my eyes perhaps the most interesting example of the bunch. Kyoraku reveals during his battle with Leal that one of his blades, Kyōkotsu, was in fact created to hide Nanao's Zanpakuto, the ceremonial blade of the Issei clan, the Shinken Hakkyoken. Though Can't Fear Your Own World corroborates this, there are a couple of oddities here that we need to discuss. First of all, although Kyoraku states in chapter 651 that Ohana, another name for Katen, gave birth to Okyo, another name for Kyōkotsu, in order to hide the Shinken Hakkyoken, Kyoraku later says in that same chapter that the sword was given to Okyo to hide because she was fond of hide and seek, which implies to me at least that Okyo had been around for some time, Enough to manifest a personality, at least. I guess it's possible that because Nanao's mother wanted to hide the blade, Okyo was created with a ready-made personality to hide it away forever. The only other thing that I find strange about this is that in the following chapter, 652, during another flashback sequence, we see Nanao's mother giving Kyoraku the Shinken Hakkyoken to hide, yet he appears to be wearing the uniform of the academy at the time. First of all, this would make Nanao extremely old, way older than she appears to be at least, but I guess that's possible. I mean, look at Unohana. Secondly, and more importantly, had Kyoraku even achieved Shikai yet by this point? If he hadn't, then perhaps he waited for a while before attaining it and then asked Katen to create a second sword, though why couldn't Katen herself simply hide the blade? In my opinion, the answer to that second question, and this kind of opens another can of worms to be honest, is that Kyōkotsu is the part of the Zanpakuto that controls the ability of Kageoni, or the ability to hide things within the shadows, as we see taken quite literally in that battle against Lille, as Kyoraku hides both himself, Nanao, and his Zanpakuto spirits within the shadows for a considerable amount of time. Considering Kyoraku seems to call upon Okyo to activate Kageoni during that fight, it seems likely to me that Katen doesn't have the ability to hide things in the shadows like Kyōkotsu does. Also, if he hadn't yet achieved Shikai, perhaps his desire to help Nanao's mother hide the blade manifested a Shikai that could assist him in this way. The other possibility is that Kyoraku isn't in the academy here and already has Shikai, which I suppose would just be Katen at this point, a single scimitar. But he really does look like he's in the academy there. Another question I have is, can any Shinigami ask their Zanpakuto to simply create a second blade? Is Katen Kyōkotsu manifestly more powerful for having two swords, and if so, how difficult was it for Kyoraku to achieve? I know a lot of people like to joke about Kyoraku and Katen sleeping together, but I doubt that's what actually happened, though admittedly Katen does like to talk to Kyoraku as though she's a lover scorned or something, so I mean, who knows? Anyway, after all of that, the main point is that Katen Kyōkotsu didn't start out as a dual Zanpakuto. Kyōkotsu was created for a specific purpose, but in doing so, Kyoraku has attained a dual Zanpakuto complete with two spirits, two separate swords, and even two swords in base. So, honestly, it's about as close as a so-called regular Shinigami is ever going to get. Then, next up is Sōgyo no Kotowari, of which we've got a lot less to go on. While nothing is made of it in the source material, in Can't Fear Your Own World, Kyoraku theorizes that Mimihagi's presence had some influence on Ukitake's soul, manifesting a second entity. I guess this makes sense to some degree. After all, as we see in his tiny flashback, Ukitake was only a very young child when he became the host of Mimihagi, meaning it's been influencing his very soul since virtually day one. And this would have been way before he joined the academy or even began training with an Asauchi, so it's definitely possible that Mimihagi brought about a second soul of sorts. The problem with this is that we just don't know enough about how Mimihagi's possession of Ukitake's lungs really worked. Did the two quite literally coexist for hundreds of years, or does Mimihagi kind of disappear only to reappear when called upon, as we see in the 1000-Year Blood War arc? For example, if they did coexist, whenever Ukitake entered his inner world, was Mimihagi just there hanging out? Or at least some semblance of the right arm of the Soul King? I guess it must have been, though I'm not sure why the existence of Mimihagi, something that is totally alien to Ukitake himself, would have simply created an identical soul in the form of the exact same blade, but there you go. I feel like if Mimihagi really had been influencing Ukitake's soul from the start in such a way as to actually create him a second sword, then Sōgyo no Kotowari should have manifested itself as two totally distinct blades. Maybe you get one that looks like the version we know, and another that is twisted and maybe dripping in that black, inky substance. Either way, again, like Katen Kyōkotsu, the truth behind this Dual Zanpakutō is that it didn't occur naturally. Presumably, if Ukitake wasn't dying as a child, and therefore Mimihagi never came into contact with him, never possessed his body, when the time came for him to awaken his Zanpakuto, Sōgyo no Kotowari, if it would even be called that, would only have a single blade. It's a little sad, actually, looking back at Yamamoto's original statement in the Soul Society arc. Presumably, he knows the truth behind the Zanpakuto to some degree. At the very least, I imagine he was aware that Ukitake was playing host to the right arm of the Soul King all along, in the same way that Kyoraku knew what initiating the Kamikake meant. So, when he notes that only two exist in the world, it's funny to think that neither of them exists organically. Of course, the likelihood is simply that Kubo didn't quite plan that far ahead as to the true nature of the Zanpakuto, but still. And then we have Hisagi and his Kazeshini. Interestingly, as mentioned previously, the anime already seemed to be downplaying Kazeshini's status as a dual Zanpakuto, thanks to him only having the one Zanpakuto spirit to begin with. And again, while Kazeshini isn't really given any face time in the Thousand Year Blood War arc of substance, the true nature of Hisagi's Zanpakuto is revealed in, you guessed it, Can't Fear Your Own World. It turns out that Hisagi is the ultimate embodiment of the very idea of a Shinigami, in that his Zanpakuto itself reflects the cycle of rebirth. The dual-bladed Kusarigama represent death, while the black chain that links them together represents life. The novel goes even further than that, however, revealing that the essence of Kazeshini, the Zanpakuto itself, is found in the chain, not the blades. That definitely feels like a bit of a loophole to me, but fair enough, it works. It's revealed as well that the chains themselves are able to pull Hisagi's body back together again when he suffers a fatal injury, keeping him alive so long as he has enough Reryoku pumping through him, and that Kazeshini's ability was even strong enough to prevent Leelbaro from being able to snipe Hisagi dead in a single shot. But again, the key takeaway here is that Hisagi doesn't have a dual Zanpakuto. Kazeshini's true Shikai is the chain itself. This is also somewhat dubious in my opinion, and I don't believe this was the original intention for this Zanpakuto, but a clear effort is being made to systematically shut down the notion of dual Zanpakuto as we thought we knew them, much in the same way the Thousand Year Blood War arc tried to stamp out the idea of constant release Zanpakuto as well. By the end of it, none of these Shinigami have naturally occurring dual Zanpakuto, whatever that means. Each of these Shinigami are being influenced by an outside force of some kind. Kyoraku had to create a second blade to fulfill Nanao's mother's request to hide the Shinken Hakyoken. Ukitake has been playing host to Mimihagi since way before he began training with an Asauchi, while Ichigo is a hybrid of all spiritual races. The composition of his Zanpakuto influenced by the fact that White, Aizen's experiment, contained a purpose-built virus designed to deliver holification to a designated target, meaning its holo-reiatsu seeped successfully into everything else about Ichigo from the very start. Isshin was then forced to keep White's reiatsu at bay for years, inadvertently fusing the two powers together to create the white Ichigo we know today. If Masaki hadn't been bitten by Aizen's experiment, what would Zangetsu look like? Old Man Zangetsu is the separate entity here. I assume the only reason Ichigo manifests the small blade at all is because he accepts his Quincy power as a part of himself and wants to use it. Of the four of these characters, Ichigo now feels like the closest to a natural dual Zanpakuto wielder. Even though his birth was influenced by an outside force, in this case White, he was still born this way. He's had this latent power since day one. The blade is me is just him finally piecing it all together and seeing what shape it takes. Ichigo has two totally separate spirits residing inside him, and they finally find balance in that moment and take on the form of two swords as a result. But also, as Kubo himself noted on Club Outside, Ichigo's two swords now also take on the properties of a sword and a sheath, the two essential components of any Zanpakuto that up until now Zangetsu didn't have. The smaller Quincy blade acts as the sheath, while the bigger one is the sword. So, the fact that Ichigo's Dual Zanpakutō fulfills this role implies to me that this is absolutely how his power should be, and should have been from the start. To me, that might be why Kubo is actively trying to downplay the rest of the Dual Zanpakutō. He wants Ichigo to be the only one to have one that feels natural, even if it technically isn't still. And so, there you have it, the secret truth of the Dual Zanpakutō. None of them occur naturally and have all either been influenced by an outside force or simply aren't Dual Zanpakuto to begin with. In this case, that's Kazeshini. Whether you accept these explanations is of course up to you, but it does seem like Kubo is taking steps to demystify the Dual Zanpakuto and perhaps leave Ichigo's Zangetsu as the only one to feel closest to a true dual blade. Though I would still argue that Kyoraku has quite literally created a Dual Zanpakuto for himself. It is interesting though that they each have their own different aspects to them. Like I mentioned earlier, Kyoraku for example is the only one to have two totally separate blades while in base. So did the smaller wakizashi simply appear when Katen created Kyōkotsu? There are still a lot of questions, but for now, this is what we know. But that's it for the video, guys. As always, I really hope you enjoyed it. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. How do you feel about the notion of the Dual Zanpakuto? How do you feel about the explanation given for how each of them isn't quite a naturally occurring phenomenon after all? I'd love to hear your thoughts about all of this down in the comments below. And as always, I want to end the video by saying a massive thank you and giving a huge shout out to my supporters over on Patreon. I really do appreciate each and every one of you so very much. If you like what I do here on YouTube and you want to support me as well, you can do just that to get your name in the credits like this and to get every video I release absolutely ad-free. Alright guys, but until next time, I'll catch you later and I'll see you then.